Well, we have, I think, half an hour, a room full of professionals and a lot of topics to talk about. So I think we should use our time well and just open the floor for questions from the audience. So I would say use your time well and use also the fact that you have, I think, if there's any trio of persons who can have a total picture of this very, very complex PSD2 field, I think you have that group here in front of you. So I would say let's just dive in. Could I ask for the first question? Please, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Simon Lelyveld. I'm wondering if you could elaborate slightly more on the context behind the competition investigation that suddenly surprised people in the Netherlands, and that seemed to have to do with the PSD2 and access to the account. So is there anything you can add to what we already don't know?
You may have more information than I have. We are working closely with the colleagues on DG Competition, but they are very discreet. So they refer us to the press release. That's all the information we get, and then we get some information from payment institutions. So we know a little bit where it happened, but we don't know exactly what happened. I don't know. Maybe one of you knows more about that. And are free to talk about it. That's the other question, of course.
Nothing from this side, I guess.
Initiated it, and I think we would also refer to the news, the press release. Yeah.
So, good question, but we don't have the answer here yet. So that is to be awaited. Maybe another question. Go ahead.
A question to Mrs. Heijmans van den Berg. Maybe I didn't hear you correctly, but you seem to refer to a commission decision that banks prescribe their interface as being risky. It wasn't quite clear to me what you referred to.
Well, I don't. That's certainly not what what we were trying to imply. I think we're trying to imply that there are risks for closure for new entrants, and the only thing I refer to is maybe the API discussion or the free access.
I sort of wrote it down. I believe you said that it was only APIs developed by banks that was mandatory. You seem to imply that you want APIs developed by TPPs.
No, that's not what I tried to say. I think what we tried to say is if it's only the bank's APIs that apply now, does it get higher entry barriers than for other entrants? So it's nothing else than that. No.
Yes, I also have a question for Ms. Simon Sandberg. You commented that one of the things that might be the biggest challenge is having well-informed consumers. And I was wondering if you could possibly expand a little on what really is the challenge there and what are some of the ways in which we might approach it.
Well, I think as we have seen in certain research now, is also what Job explained. I think that well, it's not clear what consumers want or if they want to dive into, let's say, new payment structures. And the question always is that because they don't want it, or is it because they're not all are not transparent enough, or don't make enough or don't give them enough information for them to have an informed choice. So I think that's the task we have together, and that's a difficult task. Yeah.
I think it's important because data protection and privacy are key for the success of PSD2. That's really the case. It's also essential to maintain trust in the payment system because it is built on trust, and in banks, by the way. And the willingness of people to share data is quite minimal at the moment. So how of consumers? Yeah, exactly. How can you change that game? Maybe people would like to share account data in the remote future or so, but what will be the trigger for that? My feeling is it will not come overnight. So that's a big question for me. They are so reluctant to give their data, account data, to third parties which are more or less related to the financial sector, and they're so willing to give it to Google or whatever. What's behind that? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Yeah, the disc. Yeah.
If the consumer can tick and get 2 or 3% discount and disclose his payment data in return, maybe some consumers may be inclined to do so, not knowing what in the long run could be the disadvantage of disclosing all your payment data. Maybe.
I would think it is a recipe for a big incident or a big backlash as well, and I wonder whether there is a role for government to set a standard here and to protect people a little bit. It sounds good to have this done by the market, but maybe 5 years from now we'll have a lot of trouble. So is that what the authority for privacy in the Netherlands is going to do? Are they going to set a standard for this and protect people a bit as well? Not so clear. No.
That's also clear at the moment, but you are right. Each scandal, each accident will create an enormous setback.
Yeah, that would be my worry. And I think giving payments data is rather special. That's not just ordinary data. Yeah. Rob?
Yep. If I may come in on that, I mean, there are, we have standards. With the regulatory technical standard, we will set security standards for the modalities of transmitting data, but also for the type of data that can be transmitted and stored and used, and how they can be used. So the directive clearly says that only the data needed for the provision of the service in question, so payment initiation or account information, can be obtained and stored. So you cannot make other uses of the data, like direct marketing, selling on the data, and so on. That's the principle. What will happen in practice is another matter. And I'm aware that in the UK, for instance, I think there will be lots of requests for licenses to develop other business models, namely to get an overview of your financial situation with your account information service license, and then offer targeted financial services to customers. That's something which we need to monitor carefully, whether this is really in the customer's interest. Then the other issue is the safety of payments itself, given that you may be sharing credentials still. There the question is, can we, I mean, so far the safety record of third-party providers has been good. I'm not aware of any major incident which has occurred with the existing payment initiation service providers and the account information service providers, which we know at the European level. But something may happen if you share your credentials, and here we can limit damages through other measures, strong customer authentication, certification requirements, and so on. So there's a lot in PSD2 and the RTS, and the dynamic linking, so that you have a unique code for each transaction. That also is an important security element. So I think we are moving in the right direction with that, but it takes a lot of effort to create confidence in the system.
Could I I'll come to you in a moment, but a little sort of follow-up question. So you can set standards for this, but not for the APIs, I think you said earlier. Why is that?
Well, you mentioned it, technology neutrality. We have not been given a mandate to impose a particular technology for the transmission of data. But at the same time, we see that there's a strong interest in, also a public interest, in having standardized APIs, because it lowers barriers, entry barriers to the market compared to the current situation with screen scraping, which requires this huge investment. So we can at best create incentives for market players to get together and work on a standard, and the standard can then later be endorsed by European standardization bodies, but that is really for the industry to decide whether they want to go in that direction.
My worry would be that these standards then will be national standards, and you will then have a fragmented market within Europe. And once you have them, it will be difficult to then raise them to the European level. But that's a discussion we come to maybe in a moment. I think the gentleman has a question on this topic.
Basically, it links into the point you were just making, because if I'm not mistaken, there's a line in the RTS that states that the standards you should align to European or international standards. So given the fact that there are developments towards national standards, I was questioning how, from a supervisory perspective, the push towards international standards would be made.
There are some standards for the transmission of payment-related data under ISO and so on. But this is I mean, there are other standardization efforts going on at the national level. The Open Banking Initiative, there's a Polish standard. There is a Slovak standard, the French are developing a standard with STAT, and there is this Europe-wide initiative, which is kind of unfortunately called the Berlin Group, which makes it sound a bit German, but it is a European-wide standardization effort, and STAT, for instance, the French standardization initiative, is part of that, as are other national standardization initiatives. So there is a hope that that this will lead to some convergence, perhaps towards a European standard.
Just how long will that take? Just
well,
your hunch.
It doesn't have to take very long, because there's a keen interest on both the banks and the TPP side to have a standard which they can follow well in advance of the application date of the RTS. Because in the RTS we said that you have to make your API, which should be based on the standard, available for testing, closed-loop testing, for 3 months, and then it has to be market tested for another 3 months. And that means 6 months before the application date, you have to be ready with your API based on a standard, if you want to avoid having to invest in the fallback mechanism. And banks and TPPs are working towards that goal.
Yeah, my colleague Max, he's part of the Berlin Group, so as a payments association, we are part of this pan-European effort, and we really see some convergence here instead of fragmentation. So there will maybe a handful as things will play out. We see many banks sort of converting to let's go for the standard of the Berlin Group.
We are talking, let's say, security issues and informational issues, and consumers need to be informed to make well decisions. But are the retailers here also not consumers in that sense? For retailers, PSD2 is also very complicated. There are conditions, there are different players, there are guarantees. They also need to understand that, and they need to be also very clear to their consumers in terms of consent. So we're talking about consumer information, but I think retailers also need a lot of information here to have a smooth transition.
A statement or a question, but maybe.
Well, there's a short answer, I think, right?
Do we mean to say? Because what you are trying to say, that's at least my hunch, is that retailers need information. What's going to happen? The information issue with consumers is more delicate. That is information that is provided by consumers to third parties. What do you mean something else?
No, I see there is a difference in type of information. In the end, consumers have to sort of consume their surplus. But retailers must also, in order also to give information to the consumers, it's also very complicated for them. They also need to be very aware on what PSD2 will mean for them. And that is also complicated.
But they have the information from their interaction with the client. I guess they have that. I mean, if you pay in a shop, then the shop knows what you pay for. Let's move on to the next question here.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to the privacy issue, if I may. And I have a question for Mr. Jacob. Today we are talking about two issues, in fact, in my opinion. We're talking about payments and we're talking about payments data and privacy. And privacy is a very sensitive issue. Job Swank already referred to the reluctance of consumers to share their data. So my question is, why did the Commission choose to combine payment initiation services and account information services in the PSD2 framework? Because perhaps if it had only been on payment initiation services, PSD2 would have been more easily acceptable.
Yeah, I wasn't there when this discussion took place. Account information services are somewhat different from payment initiation services. They're not necessarily directly related to payments, but we also see convergence. We see business models which combine account information with the possibilities to make payments, to transfer money from one account to another, for instance, or to trigger payments of someone else to someone else from the same app. So, in a forward-looking way, I think it's good to have them both in the same regulatory framework. Now, you can get a different license for payment initiation and for account information. You can also have both licenses, but when you have both licenses, then we want to make it as easy as possible for the service provider to get the information. This should all happen in one session. So this is basically what the legislative framework says. But account information is a little bit different from many of the other things covered by PSD2, indeed.
Yes, so I got an email by Esther White. She says she can't attend due to the traffic conditions, but we would like to ask of Jacob, who should, in your view, regulate blockchain or cryptocurrencies?
Well, the big question here is it a currency or is it an asset? It's now being treated like an asset. I mean, Bitcoin was invented for payment purposes, but I can't think of anything worse for payments than Bitcoin. In terms of, it's slow, it's very expensive, it consumes a huge amount of energy, tens of thousands of times more than a credit card transaction. So as a means of payment, we can forget about it. There may be other cryptocurrencies which are better suited for that purpose, but well, I don't want to go too much into that detail. Now, who should regulate that? We are reflecting on that. Should it fall within MiFID, or is there another regulatory framework which would fit? It's a bit early to say how we want to deal with that.
Would Bitcoin or the other cryptocurrencies survive once you regulate it? That's a big question. Because
maybe the right regulation, but this is a personal view, is to just simply make it illegal. But and I guess that's more or less. That's more. No, that's. I mean, I think that's what's happening now, no? Yeah. I mean, and it's governments pushing it. I think the governments, South Korea, the French, China, speeches, they're sort of pushing it out.
I mean, we have started regulating it through anti-money laundering legislation. By making it compulsory for the wallet providers and the exchanges to lift the anonymity. So that is already a step towards regulation, of course.
Could I maybe throw in a question of my own? Maybe Ralph, and you addressed also in your talk, or you touched upon the issue of subsidiarity. And it seems to me in this PSD2 field, there is really a very strong case to do as much as possible at the European level. So I'm just wondering, whether you could elaborate a little bit on that, and why did you not have a European regulation and a European supervisor do a lot of this? Why put it into national law with a lot of risks of fragmentation again?
Well, that would be a big step to have a regulation and supervision at the European level. We would need something much bigger than the European Banking Authority to carry out supervision.
We have a European Central Bank which does already.
Or it could be done by yes, but not for all banks. Don't forget that. So we haven't this level of centralization for other financial services apart from banks, and they're only for the systemically important institutions. I think it's good that we can continue to rely on the regulatory and supervisory capacities in the member states. But of course, at the same time, we also want to make sure that there's convergence, supervisory convergence, and we want the national supervisors to cooperate. So that we move towards a uniform market. But there are other problems as well. I mean, we need to overcome fragmentation. We need to make sure that payment methods which are being developed by groupings of national banks, for instance, could extend and have a European-wide scope. Ideal is kind of ideal, but the big drawback is it only works in the Netherlands. The Finns have a similar system. Could we not try to have something like this at the European scale?
It would really all member states.
Sorry?
It works in all member states.
If you have
only at the web shop side, but only for Dutch consumers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
What your
kind of follow up, because when you think about the European level, there are at least I think 3 issues. The first is there are loose ends in PSD2 and the GDPR. I think that's for the European level. The avoidance of market fragmentation you mentioned, I doubt, but I think some role for Europe would be nice.
Oh yes.
Yeah. The view on the role of big tech. How do you organize countervailing power when it comes to a conflict? Because a natural monopoly is probably not the best outcome for Europe. And once you start fighting it, most of the time you're too late. And here there are, I think, a couple of questions that are urgent for the future years, which has to be picked up, I think, by the Commission in the end.
Maybe also touch on this point, and is that the Commission, is it ACM, is it the corporation, who is going to look at that?
I think especially when you talk about setting standards, or well, maybe about the big techs, but especially setting standards should be on a European level. There's no question about that, I would say. And if you look at the national level, maybe there's an implementation that is different in different states. I'm not sure always. So there will always be a national or a regional influence that you need. But I think on European level, you have to look at to set the standards. As far as big techs are concerned, if the big techs are going to be the new incumbents, then we're going to the dark side, in a way. So I agree with Job that that we need to think about how we confront it, how we organize competition. Also for the big techs. And if I understood your presentation, especially on the privacy issue and the using of data for big techs, then you're already regulating, if you will, the purpose of the data for the big techs. Yeah.
If I may add to that, very briefly, I mean, first of all, I would make a link between big tech and fragmentation. If we overcome fragmentation, then European players will have more cloud compared to the big techs. And then the big techs, they do run into problems with privacy. They might foul of our regulations, both GDPR and PSD2. And then, of course, we have means to control abuse of dominant position. So competition law is quite effective.
So that will help then to be proactive, because I think Job made a good point that when you start moving when the monopoly is there, then you're much too late.
Maybe one because the legislation process in the EU is not that fast.
Yeah, but competition policy is fast. Is fast. Yes.
Yeah.
Questions?
Yes, I have a question myself. In October, the Boston Consulting Group published a report stating that they expect the global revenue of the payments industry to double in approximately the next 10 years. So, from an economic perspective, I found this worrying because we don't expect the global economy to double in the next 10 years. So this means that payment services in industry is an intermediary, its transaction cost, if you will, increases. So there could be two reasons, valid reasons. One is there's a market imperfection, a market position, or current market position. Boston Consulting Group thinks the industry is going to exploit. The second one is, of course, they think that there's a new market to be created with new products and new services and people willing to pay for that. Well, of course, there's a third alternative, and that's that they're simply wrong. I'd like to hear your views on the outlook for the industry as a whole. In this,
I'd like to say something about it.
I really don't know. I'm not aware of this. I'm aware of the research, but I didn't study it. What did it say about cash in circulation? Because there is a trade-off between the two. And I don't think it is so that people are going to like to pay and increase it without one real economic transaction behind it. But again, I didn't study the research.
No, sir, I don't expect you to comment on research you didn't study.
No.
My question was more general, as this research as a starting point. What's your outlook on the market? Do you expect the payments industry to grow, and for good reasons or for bad reasons?
Yeah, if the consumer wants to pay for certain transactions, it's a good reason, I guess, because then they derive utility from it. But I'm not sure about that, and it would contradict what I said earlier this afternoon. So
I think Boston means that you see a substitution to much more electronic and mobile payments. That business will grow, but probably at the expense of cash payments.
What you see in Sweden or in the Netherlands, by the way.
Yeah. I'm not aware of this study, but if it's global, then there may be markets outside the developed countries. So, and if you move from cash to electronic payments, then you get an industry, whereas cash handling would be done by the retailers themselves, and it would be in the traditional banking system. It would not appear in the statistics in the same way. But for Europe, the production costs in payments will go down with instant payments, and quite radically. So if you want to capture more money through payment products, you have to have ancillary services like insurance, bonus cards, or something like this. Maybe that grows. But, I don't know.
I think there was a question up in the corner. Go ahead.
I want to ask you to Mrs. Heijmans van den Berg. This is a question, and it puzzles me, so I wouldn't blame you if you don't have an immediate answer, but this, on the one hand, and this is payments, it is a system, it has to work and it has to be efficient. In order to be efficient, it helps sometimes if you harmonize, and I think the best example we in the Netherlands understand is when we travel to the US and we want to make a card payment, there's like 10 different machines on the counter, and based on the bank you use, you pick one of the machines and you pay, whereas in the Netherlands there's always one. And that's because there was a standardization that fits to any card, so the cards are multiple, but there is a standard for what is on the counter. So if you now go to PSD2 and working with PSD2, and we briefly discussed the burning group, what makes an initiative, for example, to come to at least a few, I mean, it doesn't have to be one API, but at least a few, and not every 8,000 banks in Europe having their own API for fintechs to plug in. So what if we only have a few APIs that will facilitate fintechs to connect to banks to get the payment data and have an efficient and smooth payment happening? To what extent is that good that they are working together towards that? And where do they cross a threshold? And are they actually creating a threshold to new entrants? And I find that talking to parties in the market and players in the market, I find that since the ACM and the Commission have done what we briefly discussed in the first question, I find a hesitance with banks to continue to work towards that standard. And being from a central bank, we cannot regulate it, markets become hesitant, and we will miss a standard in the market. Thank you.
Well, I think I'll start at the end of your question. I think technical standards, as I hope I stressed, is a good and have lots of merits. So the question is not the technical standards, but the question is, do you organize standards that exclude other parties or exclude entrants, new entrants? So cooperation to set standards to organize that everybody can enter there's nothing that we're against. So if banks are hesitant, maybe I can understand if the Commission sort of does an inspection. I can understand that you're hesitant, but it shouldn't block cooperation for the right reasons. And right reasons could be setting standards that with everyone together. Well, if they're still hesitant, maybe they should come and talk to us or ask their lawyers what they can do and what they not can do. Be transparent about it, yeah. I agree.
My job is to look at the clock here, so Half wants to say something about this, and then I think we need to wrap up.
What you have just said. If banks do it alone and other market players, be it consumers or the TPPs, are not happy about it, there is a problem with competition, and banks should be wary about that, and they should fear the intervention of competition authority. But banks are now opening up, the Berlin Group being an example of this, opening up to other market players, and they want to have a comprehensive approach which satisfies all sides of the market, and that's a good development.
Thank you very much. I think we have covered a lot of topics, and some questions have been answered. Some were not answerable at this stage because it's a very dynamic process, of course. So I think I should hand the microphone back to Jasper. Maybe before I do so, suggest that you organize another panel like this in 1 or 2 years, because then we'll know how all of this is going.